Imagine a world that looks suspiciously like our own. It is a world of global trade, international treaties, and complex supply chains. Kings in Egypt send emails written on clay tablets to CEOs in Babylon. They complain about shipping delays, negotiate gold prices, and arrange royal weddings. This was the Late Bronze Age. It was the first global economy in human history. And then, in a single lifetime, the lights went out. To understand how it ended, we have to look at a city called Ugarit on the coast of modern-day Syria. In 1177 BC, Ugarit was the New York City of the ancient world. It was rich, loud, and bustling. But inside the ruins of the royal palace, archaeologists found something chilling. They found a clay tablet lying in a kiln, an oven used for baking clay. But this tablet wasn't baked by a potter. It was baked by the fire that burned the city to the ground. The text on the tablet is a desperate scream for help. It was written by the last king of Ugarit, Amurapi, to a neighboring king. He writes, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us." The handwriting is messy. The scribe was rushing. He knew the enemy was at the gates. He threw the tablet into the oven to harden it so it could be sent, but he was too late. The messenger never left. The city was sacked, the people were slaughtered, and the palace collapsed on top of the oven. This wasn't just the fall of a city. It was the first domino in the collapse of the entire civilized world. Within 50 years, every major city between Greece and Gaza was destroyed. The Hittite Empire vanished. The Mycenaean Greeks forgot how to write. The world entered a dark age so deep that for 3 centuries, history simply stopped. Who were the ships? Who burned the world? And why does this collapse look so terrifyingly similar to the fragilities of our own modern world? If you traveled back to 1300 BC, you wouldn't find a world of isolated barbaric tribes. You would find a geopolitical order that looks strikingly modern. Historians call this the Club of Great Powers. There were 4 or 5 superpowers running the world. The Egyptians in the south, the gold superpower. The Hittites in the north, the military iron superpower. The Babylonians in the east, the cultural capital. The Mycenaeans in the west, the Greeks of the Iliad. These kings didn't just fight, they were pen pals. We have found their letters preserved in the sands of Amarna, Egypt. They addressed each other as brother. They married each other's sisters. They sent angry messages when a wedding gift arrived late. One Babylonian king famously wrote to the pharaoh, "Send me more gold. In your land, gold is as common as dust, but in my land, we need it." But it wasn't just talk. It was a physical web of dependency. The smoking gun for this globalization was found in 1982, deep underwater off the coast of Turkey. The Uluburun shipwreck. This ship sank around 1300 BC. When divers examined the cargo, they were stunned. It contained copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, ebony wood from Africa, amber from the Baltic Sea, Northern Europe, glass from Canaan, pottery from Greece. This ship wasn't just a merchant vessel, it was a microcosm of the world economy. And crucially, it carried the ingredients for the era's most important technology, bronze. To make bronze, you need copper and tin. You can find copper in Cyprus, but there is almost no tin in the Mediterranean. It had to be imported from thousands of miles away through dangerous trade routes in Afghanistan. This means that nobody could make weapons or tools alone. The Hittites needed the Afghans. The Greeks needed the Cypriots. The entire civilization was built on a just-in-time supply chain. As long as the ships kept sailing, everyone got rich. But if the ships stopped, the Bronze Age wouldn't just slow down, it would end. In 1177 BC, the supply chain broke. Reports started flooding into the royal courts of Egypt and Hatti. Coastal watchtowers reported massive fleets of ships appearing on the horizon. They weren't merchant vessels, they were war parties. Victorian archaeologists later dubbed them the Sea Peoples, but at the time, they were a nameless terror. The Egyptians listed them as a confederation of tribes with strange names: the Sherden, the Shekelesh, the Peliset, and the Denyen. We know what they looked like because the pharaoh Ramesses III carved their faces into stone to celebrate their victory over them. At the Temple of Medinet Habu in Luxor, there is a massive relief depicting the invasion. It shows warriors unlike any the Egyptians had seen before. Some wear helmets with horns. Others wear tall, feathered headdresses that look like mohawks. They carry round shields and long, slashing swords instead of the curved Egyptian hopesh. But the relief reveals a crucial detail that changes the story. It doesn't just show soldiers, it shows ox carts. It shows women and children walking alongside the warriors. This wasn't just a raiding party. This was a migration. These people weren't just coming to steal gold, they were coming to move in. They were fleeing something terrible in their own homelands, and they were desperate enough to burn down the world to find a new place to live. The great powers were prepared for war, but they were prepared for the wrong kind of war. The Hittites and Egyptians fought with chariots, the tanks of the ancient world. Chariots are expensive, require flat terrain, and need support crews. The Sea Peoples didn't play by the rules. They were infantry skirmishers. They ran between the chariots, slashing at the horses' legs. They cut the supply lines. They burned the ports. The mighty Hittite Empire, which had stood for centuries and rivaled Egypt in power, collapsed almost instantly. Their capital, Hattusa, was sacked and burned so thoroughly that the stones themselves turned red from the heat. The superpower of the north was erased from the map, leaving a power vacuum that would never be filled. Why did the Sea Peoples move? Entire nations don't pack their wives, children, and grandparents into ox carts and march thousands of miles into hostile territory just for plunder. You raid for gold. You migrate for survival. For decades, historians looked for a political reason, but the answer wasn't in the libraries. It was in the mud. In 2013, a team of scientists drilled deep into the bottom of the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. They pulled up long cylinders of ancient mud, pollen cores. By analyzing the microscopic pollen grains trapped in the layers, they reconstructed the climate of the past. What they found was terrifying. Around 1200 BC, the pollen from oak trees and lush plants suddenly disappeared. It was replaced by the pollen of dry desert scrub. The data pointed to a massive, rapid climate shift, a mega-drought that didn't just last for a summer, it lasted for 300 years. This scientific data matches perfectly with the voices from the past. As the rains failed, the crops died, and when the crops died, the global web began to starve. We found a letter sent from the Hittite king to the pharaoh of Egypt. It isn't a diplomatic greeting, it is a beg. He writes, "I have no grain in my lands. It is a matter of life and death." Another letter from a merchant in the city of Imar says, "There is famine in our house. We will all die of hunger." If you do not arrive quickly, we ourselves will die of hunger. You will not see a living soul." This changes our understanding of the Sea Peoples completely. They weren't Vikings looking for a fight. They were climate refugees. Their homelands in the Western Mediterranean, likely Italy, Sicily, and Sardinia, had dried up. They were starving. They looked east toward the rich irrigated lands of Egypt and the Levant, and they started walking. They were a desperate wave of humanity fleeing an ecological collapse. But when they arrived in the east, they found those kingdoms were starving too. The Hittites didn't have enough food for themselves, let alone for 1,000,000 migrants. So the gates were closed. The swords were drawn. The climate crisis forced a migration crisis, which triggered a military crisis. The perfect storm had begun. As if famine and invasion weren't enough, the ground itself turned against them. For a long time, historians dismissed the idea that earthquakes could destroy a civilization. Earthquakes happen all the time, they said. You rebuild. But in the late Bronze Age, something statistically impossible happened. Geologists call it an earthquake storm. The Mediterranean sits on a mess of tectonic fault lines. Usually, they slip one at a time, centuries apart. But sometimes a zipper effect occurs. One massive quake releases pressure on a fault, which immediately puts too much pressure on the next section, triggering another quake and then another. Between 1225 BC and 1175 BC, the exact 50-year window of the collapse, a chain reaction of massive seismic events ripped across the region. It started in the north and moved south. Troy was hit first, Troy 6th, then Hattusa, then Ugarit, then Megiddo, then Mycenae. It was a geological firing squad. At Mycenae, in Greece, archaeologists found skeletons of people crushed under the rubble of their own homes, not killed by swords, but by falling stones. The massive cyclopean walls were twisted and bulging, a telltale sign of seismic shifting. At Troy, the walls of the citadel cracked open, leaving the city defenseless just before it was attacked. A single earthquake is a tragedy. A 50-year sequence of them is an apocalypse. Imagine the psychological toll. You are starving, foreign armies are burning the horizon, and now the earth is shaking the temples of your gods to the ground. To the people of 1177 BC, this wasn't plate tectonics, it was divine judgment. It convinced the kings that they had lost the mandate of heaven. It convinced the soldiers that there was no point in fighting. When the Sea Peoples arrived at the gates of these broken cities, they didn't have to besiege a fortress. They just had to walk through the cracks in the walls.
So, we have a drought, a migration, and an earthquake storm. Any one of these is bad. All three together are catastrophic. But there is one final factor that turned a disaster into an extinction event: hypercomplexity. The late Bronze Age was a centralized, top-down system. Everything flowed through the palaces. The king controlled the food, the trade, the scribes, and the armies. The farmers didn't own the land, they worked for the palace. The merchants didn't trade for themselves, they traded for the palace. It was highly efficient, but it was incredibly brittle. Think of it like a modern power grid. If you cut one main cable, the whole city goes dark. When the Sea Peoples burned the ports and the pirates cut the shipping lanes, the supply of tin stopped. Remember, tin was the oil of the Bronze Age. Without tin, you can't make bronze. Without bronze, you can't make plows to farm the hard earth. You can't make spear tips to fight the invaders. You can't make chariot wheels. The Hittite army didn't just lose battles, they literally ran out of the material needed to repair their weapons. This triggered a deadly feedback loop. The trade routes broke, so the economy crashed. The economy crashed, so the kings couldn't pay the soldiers. The soldiers deserted or became bandits, so the countryside became lawless. The farmers, terrified of bandits and starving from drought, fled to the mountains. With no farmers, there was no food for the palace. The palace starved and collapsed. It wasn't a slow decline, it was a rapid, violent implosion. The central nervous system of civilization was severed. The palaces didn't just lose power, they became death traps. The people turned on their rulers, burned the tax records, and walked away into the darkness. In the midst of this apocalypse, one nation refused to die: Egypt. The pharaoh, Ramesses III, saw the smoke rising from the burning cities of the north. He knew the sea peoples were coming. Instead of meeting them in the open field where the Hittites had failed, he set a trap. He lured the sea people's fleet into the narrow, marshy mouth of the Nile Delta. Then he unleashed the archers. Pinned against the riverbanks, unable to maneuver their ships, the invaders were slaughtered. Egypt was saved. But it was a victory that killed the victor. The war drained the Egyptian treasury. To pay for the defense, the pharaoh had to empty the granaries. Shortly after the victory, history records the first labor strike in recorded history. The tomb builders at Deir el-Medina put down their tools because the government couldn't pay them their rations of grain. Egypt survived, but it was broken. It retreated behind its borders and never reached the height of its power again. The era of the Empire of the Nile was over. However, the collapse of the giants created an opportunity for the little guys. With the Hittites gone and Egypt retreating, the roof of the geopolitical world was blown off. In the power vacuum of the Levant, small, scrappy tribes began to organize. The Phoenicians, a group of coastal merchants in cities like Tyre and Sidon, took over the seas. Since the global supply chain was broken, they built a new one, smaller, faster, and more decentralized. The Israelites. In the hill country of Canaan, a loose confederation of tribes settled down and began building stone villages. Without the heavy taxation of the Egyptian Empire pressing on them, they were free to develop their own distinct culture. The collapse didn't kill everyone. It just killed the too-big-to-fail institutions. The survivors were the ones who were small, mobile, and adaptable. When the palaces of Mycenae and Pylos burned, something terrifying happened to the human mind. We forgot how to write. The Greeks of the Bronze Age used a script called Linear B. It wasn't an alphabet like we use today. It was a syllabary, hundreds of complex symbols representing sounds. It was incredibly difficult to learn. Because it was so hard, literacy was a palace secret. Only a tiny handful of professional scribes knew how to read it. They used it for one thing: accounting. They counted sheep, weapons, and jars of oil for the king. When the palaces were sacked, the scribes were either killed or sold into slavery. Because the system was so centralized, there were no schools in the villages. There were no books in the farmers' homes. When the specialist class died, the knowledge died with them. In the blink of an eye, Greece went illiterate. For the next 300 years, from 1100 BC to 800 BC, not a single word was written down in Greece. No history, no laws, no letters. The entire culture went dark. But humans have a need to remember. During these dark centuries, stories didn't die. They changed format. They moved from clay tablets to the human voice. This is the era of the bards. Poets memorized thousands of lines of verse, passing legends down from father to son. They told stories of a lost golden age of heroes, of a great war at Troy, and of kings who spoke to gods. These oral traditions were the lifeboats of civilization. They floated through the Dark Age until writing finally returned, centuries later, in a new, simpler form: the alphabet. For 2,000 years, bronze was the king of metals. It was beautiful, golden, and easy to cast. But it had a fatal flaw. It required tin. And as we saw, tin is rare. When the trade routes collapsed in 1177 BC, the supply of tin vanished. The blacksmiths of the Mediterranean were staring at useless piles of copper, unable to make weapons. Desperation drove innovation. They were forced to look at the junk rock that was lying everywhere: iron ore. Iron is the fourth most common element in the Earth's crust. It is literally everywhere. You can dig it up in your backyard. But there was a catch. Iron doesn't melt until 1538 degrees Celsius, 2800 degrees Fahrenheit. Bronze melts at just 950 degrees Celsius. To work with iron, you couldn't just cast it in a mold like bronze. You had to forge it. You had to beat the impurities out of it with a hammer while it was white hot. This shift changed everything. In the Bronze Age, weapons were expensive. Only the kings and the elite charioteers could afford good armor. This kept the social hierarchy rigid. But iron? Iron was dirt cheap. Once the blacksmiths figured out the technology of the charcoal furnace to reach those high temperatures, the price of a sword plummeted. Suddenly, you didn't need a king to arm a soldier. A peasant could arm himself. The Iron Age was the era of the common man. It democratized warfare. It meant that a small tribe of hill people, like the Israelites or Dorians, could field an army that could stand up to a pharaoh. The collapse of the sophisticated trade network led to a rougher, uglier, but much more equal world. While the great capitals of Mycenae and Hattusa lay in ruins, a string of small coastal cities in modern-day Lebanon began to glow. These were the cities of the Phoenicians: Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. They had survived the Sea People's invasion by being useful. They were the master sailors of the era. In the vacuum left by the empires, the Phoenicians realized something brilliant. Nobody was patrolling the oceans anymore. They launched a new kind of trade network. It wasn't based on royal gift exchange between kings. It was based on profit. They sailed to Spain, North Africa, and even Britain. They founded colonies like Carthage. They didn't want to conquer land. They wanted to conquer markets. But to run a global business, they had a problem. The old writing systems, cuneiform and hieroglyphs, were too slow and too complicated for busy merchants. You couldn't spend 10 years training a scribe just to write a receipt for a shipment of cedar wood. So they simplified it. They took the thousands of symbols of the past and boiled them down to just 22 characters. Each character represented a sound, not a word. This was the Phoenician alphabet. It was the Excel spreadsheet of the ancient world, designed for speed, efficiency, and commerce. Because it was so easy to learn, literacy exploded. A captain could read his own manifest. A shopkeeper could keep his own ledger. Without realizing it, the Phoenicians had created the most dangerous weapon of all, a writing system that anyone could use. They funded this expansion with a single luxury product, Tyrian purple. They discovered that if you crushed the shell of the murex sea snail, it produced a dye that didn't fade. In fact, it got brighter in the sun. It was smelly, disgusting work, but it was worth more than gold. In a drab world of brown wool and unbleached linen, wearing purple was the ultimate status symbol. It shouted, "I survived the collapse, and I am rich." The Phoenicians built an empire not on swords, but on snails and the ABCs. For 400 years, during the dark, illiterate centuries, the Greeks kept a specific memory alive through song. They sang of a time when men were like gods. They sang of golden Mycenae, rich in gold. They sang of a great world war across the sea, the Trojan War. For centuries, modern historians dismissed these stories as pure fiction. Agamemnon, Achilles, Hector, they were just characters like Batman or Superman. But they were wrong. In the 1870s, a German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann followed the clues in the Iliad like a treasure map. He went to Turkey, dug a massive trench, and hit stone. He found Troy. But the most shocking discovery wasn't the gold, it was the dirt. Archaeologists identified a specific layer of the city known as Troy 7A. It dates to exactly 1180 BC. This layer isn't just a ruin, it is a crime scene. The houses were destroyed by fire. We found skeletons unburied in the streets. We found piles of sling stones gathered by the defenders in a desperate last stand. Troy wasn't destroyed by a mythological wooden horse. It was destroyed by the same earthquake storm and sea people's migration that burned the rest of the world. Suddenly, the Odyssey makes sense in a new way. It isn't just an adventure story. It is the story of a veteran trying to get home through a broken world. When Odysseus visits foreign lands, he finds them lawless and dangerous. The old kings are dead. Monsters, pirates, and bandits rule the seas. When he finally gets home to Ithaca, he finds his own palace overrun by suitors, young, violent warlords who have no respect for tradition. This is a perfect snapshot of the Greek Dark Age. The suitors are the new, chaotic generation living in the ruins of the order that collapsed in 1177 BC. The myths were true. They were just remembering the end of the world. It is easy to look at 1177 as a tragedy. We see the burning libraries and the starving children, and we mourn the golden age that was lost. But historians have a controversial theory. The collapse saved us. The late Bronze Age was impressive, but it was also a prison. It was a world of command economies. The king owned everything. The priests controlled the knowledge. The average person was an illiterate serf with zero social mobility. It was a stable system, but it was stagnant. Innovation was slow because the palaces didn't like change. When the Sea Peoples burned the palaces, they didn't just destroy the economy, they broke the chains. The chaos that followed was the Wild West of history. Without the oppressive taxes of the great kings, small communities were free to experiment. In Greece, the fall of the Mycenaean kings led eventually to the rise of the polis, the city-state. Instead of being subjects of a god-king, men became citizens of a democracy. In Israel, the power vacuum allowed the Hebrew prophets to write down a revolutionary idea that even kings are subject to the law. In technology, the shortage of bronze forced the rapid adoption of iron, which made tools cheaper and farming more efficient for everyone, not just the elite. If the Bronze Age had never collapsed, we might still be living under the rule of divine pharaohs, writing on clay tablets and stuck in a rigid caste system. The fire of 1177 BC burned away the dead wood of an old, rotting forest. It cleared the canopy and allowed new, smaller, faster-growing trees to find the sunlight.
The Dark Age wasn't the end of civilization. It was the labor pains of the modern world.
When we look at the people of 1177 BC, we see ourselves. We aren't like the Romans or the medieval knights. We are the late Bronze Age 2.0. Like them, we live in a hyper-globalized world. We rely on just-in-time supply chains. We rely on international peace treaties. We rely on a climate that behaves itself. And like them, our system is efficient, but it has zero redundancy. Think about it. In 1200 BC, the world stopped because the supply of tin from Afghanistan was cut off. What is our tin? Is it oil? Is it rare earth metals? Is it the semiconductors made in a single factory in Taiwan? If a modern Sea Peoples event, a war, a pandemic, or a blockade cut off the supply of microchips, our civilization wouldn't just slow down, it would crash. Cars wouldn't start, phones wouldn't work, the power grid would fail. We have built a machine that is too complex to fix if it breaks. And the trigger is already being pulled. The drought that destroyed the Hittites is a haunting preview of our own future. As the equator gets hotter, millions of people are going to move. We are already seeing the early waves of climate refugees. The Sea Peoples weren't villains, they were families looking for water. When millions of people are desperate, borders don't matter, walls don't matter. The lesson of 1177 BC is simple. You cannot hide from a global problem behind a local wall. When the system collapses, it collapses for everyone, the rich palace and the poor village alike.
For centuries, archaeology was an art. Historians read the Iliad, looked at a ruin, and guessed what happened. But the story you are hearing today isn't based on guesses. It is based on forensics. We have stopped treating the past like a poem and started treating it like a crime scene. How do we know the Sea Peoples were migrants and not just soldiers? We ask their teeth. Scientists are now using strontium isotope analysis. When you are a child, the water you drink leaves a specific chemical signature in your developing tooth enamel. It acts like a GPS tracker for your childhood. We have found skeletons in the Levant with local DNA but foreign strontium signatures. This proves they weren't born there. They traveled thousands of miles to die there. It confirms the mass migration theory with chemical certainty. How do we know about the trade routes? We use neutron activation analysis. We can take a piece of pottery found in Egypt, blast it with neutrons, and read its chemical composition. We can match that chemical fingerprint to a specific clay pit in Cyprus or Crete. We now know that a single dinner plate might have traveled 3,000 miles before it was broken. We can map the invisible highways of the Bronze Age without reading a single word. And the earthquakes, a new field called archaeoseismology has emerged. Experts study the angle at which walls collapsed. If a wall is pushed over by a battering ram, the stones fall one way. If the ground ripples beneath it like a liquid, the stones explode outward or twist in a specific pattern. We are re-examining ruins excavated 100 years ago and realizing that what we thought was war was actually nature. The science is rewriting the history books faster than we can print them.
We need to be clear about the scale of the damage. The collapse of 1177 BC wasn't a recession, it was a reboot. From nearly 3 centuries, from 1200 BC to 900 BC, the population of the Mediterranean plummeted. In some parts of Greece, 75% of the settlements were abandoned. The great arts of fresco painting, stone masonry, and gold working were forgotten. People went back to living in mud huts. They stopped trading. They stopped writing.
They just survived. But around 800 BC, the light started to flicker back on. This period is known as the Archaic Age. But the civilization that emerged from the dark was completely different from the one that went in. The old world was about stability. The new world was about competition. Without the pharaohs and great kings to tell everyone what to do, the new Greek city-states, the polis, started competing with each other furiously. They competed in war, they competed in trade, and in 776 BC, they started competing in sports. The first Olympic Games were held. It was the symbolic end of the Dark Age. The isolated tribes were talking again. The most profound shift was psychological. In the Bronze Age, art was anonymous. You built a statue for the king. You didn't sign it. In the Iron Age, we see a new phenomenon, the signature. On a simple clay pot found in Ischia dating to 720 BC, a poet scratched a joke, "I am Nestor's cup, good to drink from." It is one of the first times in history we hear the voice of a regular person making a joke, seeking fame for themselves. The collapse killed the giants, but it gave birth to the individual. The road to democracy, philosophy, and science began in the ruins of the apocalypse.
We like to think that we are immune to history. We have the internet. We have antibiotics. We have nuclear power. But the people of 1177 BC felt the exact same way. They had the internet of their day, a global network of scribes. They had the nuclear weapons of their day, the chariot. They had mastered the world. And yet, in a single generation, it all turned to dust. The story of the Late Bronze Age is the ultimate reminder that complexity is not strength. Complexity is fragility. A simple village can survive a collapse. A globalized superstate cannot. But if there is a warning in 1177 BC, there is also a promise. Civilization is not a building that stands forever. It is a garden. Sometimes the garden becomes overgrown. The old trees block the light. The soil gets exhausted. When the fire comes, whether it is war, climate change, or economic collapse, it is terrifying. It destroys the beauty we built. But the fire also returns nutrients to the soil. It clears the canopy. The collapse of the Bronze Age was a tragedy for the people who lived through it. But for us, it was a necessity. It cleared the way for the iron plow, the alphabet, democracy, and the modern mind. We are likely standing on the edge of another great transition. The climate is shifting. The systems are straining. The old empires are tired. If the collapse comes, we should not fear the dark. History shows us that humans are unkillable. We adapt, we migrate, we invent. The palaces may burn, but the people remain. And in the ashes of the old world, the seeds of the next one are already waiting to grow.